Hey everyone, welcome to this webinar on deconstructing an argument, really understanding what an argument looks like when you have to solve CR questions. So you may have been wondering for a bit who I am. My name is Matoo. I have a master's in economics from the University of Amsterdam, and I really like taking standardized tests. I know that makes me sound like a massive nerd, but it's true. I like taking them. I find them really interesting, and I like the mechanics of how you have to think about solving them. So I enjoyed that side of things. But then what I realized is that I didn't really want to gain the benefits of the rewards that those doors opened. So I wasn't particularly interested in going to business school myself. I find that I enjoy teaching a lot more. And I think that, if you have this, if you can set up a path to how you're going to understand something, that makes your job a whole lot easier. So yeah, I really enjoy teaching, and that's why I'm kind of doing this. That's why this is what I do. I have taught at crack um, and I currently teach full time. I teach international at an international high school. I teach humanities. That's like history, geography, global perspective, stuff like that. So yeah, really passionate about teaching. To let you know a little bit about Crack Verbal, we were sort of essentially founded in 2006. We've been working, to provide help for students, particularly with the GMAT, but also with the GRE and other standardized tests for a while now. And, we've taught over 5,000 students. I believe that these figures are even a little bit outdated. So I think that, it's quite a bit more than that at this point. And over 1 million coaching hours. We have our courses available to people in many different countries around the world. Particularly, we find that our material is very useful for students who come from a country in which English is not the primary language of communication. And that certainly applies to India, right? English is the language of communication in the workplace, but it's not the first language for everyone out there. And even if it is your first language, you're not in speaking to other people whose first language is English all the time. So, from that angle in particular, we find that our courses are really helpful. A few quick free resources for you all to check out. So if you're not a student yet, you can get on gmatonline.crackverbal.com. That gives you some access to parts of our courses so that you can see whether it's a good fit for you or not. Same with a few ebooks. If you go to gmat.crackverbal.com/free resources/ebook library, you should be able to find the ebooks that we have. They're very, very straightforward ebooks. They're not, there's no padding. They're quite simple. They're not long reads or anything of the sort. They're perfect to get away, in the middle of a busy day. In addition to that, we also have a bunch of strategy videos on YouTube. In fact, if I'm not wrong, some of the webinars, I know definitely some of the webinars, possibly all of them, eventually end up on YouTube as well. So part of that is quite cool as well. youtube.com/user/crackverbal videos. All right, now I see a chat that's come in. Can you please share the link for the ebooks? Okay, so I'm going to go back to that slide, and you can take it down. And while I do this, I'm also going to give you all the opportunity to to sort of get into the groove with how we will go about answering and dealing with questions as well. So at various points, I'm going to stop and take all the questions that I've got up until that point and answer them for you all. So you can feel free to ask questions at any point in time. That's totally up to you. But then once I'm done with explaining one part of a concept, I'll go over all of the questions, I'll answer them. It's quite possible that you ask a question and then I address it anyway, within the next minute or two. But, that shouldn't deter you from asking. Just feel free to do so whenever you need to. All right. So Ayush says that it's a little bit difficult to hear me. I just want to put that out to everyone. If you can hear me clearly, please hit 1. If you're not able to hear me, please hit 2. All right, I think I'm audible now. I think that's just the nature of the internet. Sometimes, you have a little bit of a lag, a little bit of ping, but hopefully I should be clear for the most part. Okay, let's dive right in. So what does GMAT critical reasoning test you on anyway? If we want to know how to approach a question and what are the basic things that we need to have figured out to approach a question, and understand the fundamentals of what they're based on, we need to know what kind of skill they're trying to test us on in the first place. Because if we know what their goal is for us, we can figure out what we need to do to help answer the questions ourselves. So what does it test us on? It tests our understanding of the construction, structure, and components of logical arguments, as well as our ability to carefully read and interpret the English language. Okay, so let's try and figure that out, right? It's the construction, structure, and components of logical arguments. So that really means that we need to understand what constitutes an argument. What does an argument look like, right? And I mean, what does an argument look like in day-to-day life? But more specifically, what does an argument look like in a critical reasoning question, right? So the construction, how it's put together, what the structure is, what the different parts are, same with the components, and ability to carefully read and interpret the English language. This is where you might have to apply your own reasoning, because you have to be able to carefully read what's going on and be able to understand what is being asked of you, right? So that's really what we want right there. Now that sounds, well, it could sound a little bit complex, but it's not the most complicated thing in the world. But despite that, we need to figure out what this construction, structure, and components actually are. If we know what that is, then it's super easy. But until we figure that out, there's still a little bit of a challenge. So let's try and see what that is. And that's really what the focus of this webinar, the focus of this topic today is going to be. And that's how we'll be able to understand the fundamentals of what a CR question demands of us. All right. So critical reasoning is 10 to 11 out of 36 of the questions. Generally, slightly fewer CR questions than the other types. Not that much fewer, but slightly fewer for sure. Each question has a stimulus. That's the argument itself. Remember that we're going to call it a stimulus simply because it helps to have those terms. When we say an argument, it could refer to the stimulus, or it could refer to the entire question, or what the purpose of the argument is. And sometimes the word argument is not very precise, so it helps to call what we see as the argument in the question stem, right? Sorry, not the question stem, the content that makes up the question, right? That we're going to call the stimulus. That's followed then by the question stem. The question stem is what the question is actually demanding of us. And as always, there are 5 options with 1 correct answer. So let's actually take a look at what such a question might look like. So over here we see that a researcher discovered that people who have low levels of immune system activity tend to score much lower on tests of mental health than do people with normal or high immune system activity. The researcher concluded from this experiment that the immune system protects against mental illness as well as against physical disease. Over here, this is essentially our stimulus. And over here we see that this is what somebody or someone is trying to do, and it gives us all of the facts. It tells us what the researcher in this case believes, or what someone believes, and what they're trying to do. All of that is really included in this first part of the question, the stimulus. This is someone else's actions. The question stem is really what demands an action from us. The question stem says, the researcher's conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. So that is the action that is demanded from us, which is that the researcher has a conclusion, And her conclusion is based on an assumption. It could be based on more than one assumption, but it's only based on one of the 5 possible assumptions in the answer options. As always, you have 5 answer options. Only one of these answer options is an assumption upon which the question is based. Now, let's actually try to go in blind and answer this question straight up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open poll number 4, which is essentially just a question. And now it has the options A, B, C, D, E. Ideally, you should be looking to solve a CR question in about 1 minute and 50 seconds or so, up to about 2 minutes. And you've had some time to take a look at the question. Oops, that's not ideal. But I will still keep this poll open for about a minute longer than this, and then you all can give in your answers. And then we'll discuss how such a question should be solved. Okay, so we have some answers that have come in. About 80% of you have attempted the question. So let's just close the poll there. Why not? And we see that answer option B wins out. So 4 of you went with A, 5 of you went with B, and 3 of you went with C, 3 of you went with D. None of you went with E. So cool, we can say that that's certainly incorrect. That certainly is. We're not looking at psychological treatment versus medical treatment, because we're just looking at levels of immunity, and that clearly seems to not matter very much. However, between the other answers, everyone is, a little bit in flux. It's certainly the case that, a minority of you got this question correct. Let's see. Okay, can we share the poll results? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I think that you all can see the results now. Excellent. So, more of you went with B than anything else, but it seems pretty spread evenly out. And what that means then is that, well, a lot of you got this question wrong, right? Now, if we are to figure out what was going on here, in fact, just to let you all know, the correct answer was answer option D, D for Delta. But how do we figure this out? What was going on here? So the researcher's conclusion depends on which of the following assumptions. And we can say that high immune system activity protects against mental illness better than normal immune system activity does. Now, if that happens to be true, then I guess, we could say that, yeah, the immune system does protect against mental illness as well against physical disease. If that's true, it does seem like that the conclusion of the researcher does seem to make sense. So fair enough, right? Mental illness is similar to physical disease in its effects on body systems. Well, that also seems to, make sense, because they're saying that the immune system protects against both. That means that the two must be similar in some way, and that's what this is saying as well. And then C says people with high immune system activity cannot develop mental illness. Well, if the two are protected, then that seems to come forward from them. If immunity protects against both, then that seems to make sense. Mental illness does not cause people's immune system activity to decrease. Well, that also seems to make sense, because if that's true, then it does mean that, or it does make it possible that, yes, the immune system can protect against both. However, right, if we're trying to actually figure out what's going on with such a question, we need to know what the building blocks of this argument look like so that it makes obvious sense. Because if so many of you got led down another path, we have to now see, what is it about this question? What has this question had to say to us that makes it harder to understand what's going on? So let's actually try to dive in first to understand what an argument even is. Then we can come back to this question and it'll become a whole lot simpler. It'll make a whole lot more sense. So almost every single argument in both the GMAT and in real life is constructed the same way. When we hear the word argument, we often think, that there is some raised temper, but or that there's a debate and ideas are being exchanged back and forth. But that's not necessarily an argument. An argument is simply somebody trying to convince you of something, is that person's argument. So let's take a look at the situation here. The World Cup finals are on, and Portugal is 2-1 down to Spain. Okay, there are 12 minutes left in extra time, and Ronaldo, who was a substitute until now, is brought on for a defender. Okay, so firstly, what are the possible outcomes or conclusions in this situation? Well, if we're being honest, well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that we can say will happen. We could say that Ronaldo will make more than 3 passes, or Ronaldo will, make a successful dribble, or, that the players will get more tired as the match goes on. Okay, those are all things that we could say will happen. Fair enough. But if we're being honest, right, when we talk about possible outcomes or the conclusions in this situation, what we're really trying to focus on is the result, right? And what are those possible results? Well, they can only really be Spain's going to win, there's going to be a draw, or rather it says World Cup final. So Spain's going to win, it's going to go to penalties, or Portugal's going to win. These are really the 3 outcomes from this 12 minutes left in extra time, right? So when we want to talk about a situation, the thing that we think will happen, or the thing that we expect to see, not the thing that we already know will happen or that we know for a fact, but the thing that we think could happen or that we're trying to convince someone of, that is really what a conclusion is. So what you want to keep in mind is that a conclusion requires some kind of convincing taking place, right? It's not something that we can say for a fact. It's something that we are trying to convince others of that will happen. So it's about what might happen. Either that could be in the future, it could be speculating about what has happened in the present and the past. But the point is that it is something that is not guaranteed for sure. Now, I would like you all to try something out. I would like you to, just think about what you think will happen and give reasons why you think that thing will happen. So if you think that Portugal will win, you could give a reason for why you think Portugal will win. If you think Spain will hold on, you can give a reason for why you think Spain will hold on. If you think that it'll end in penalties, you can give a reason for that as well. Now, when you give those reasons, you can give the reasons based on the information that's already there. You could also give the reason based on information that is not there, things that, you could make up in your head. You could say that, Spain has very short players, and those players will not be able to, survive till the end. Like they'll not be able to last till the end of the game because, the Portuguese players are much taller and they'll score off a set piece. That's not something that's mentioned. But if you think that that's a reason that could affect the result, put it out there. So I'd like to see some things in the chat for what you think will happen and why. Let's put a couple of minutes on. What do you think will happen here? And any reasons why. You can make up your own reasons. You don't have to be correct, or you don't have to be, it doesn't have to be the case that you know exactly what's going to happen, right? Just put forward what you think might happen and why you might think that happens. Okay, I see some responses that have come in. Let's see that. Ronaldo could score a goal. Okay, so now, well, that's telling me that's saying something that you think might happen, right? But really, if we were to put that in the context of a conclusion, we could say, well, Ronaldo, you could say that Portugal is going to win, or let's say Portugal, takes it to penalties because Ronaldo will score a goal. In fact, we can add to what another person has said. Ronaldo, the world's best player and in fabulous form, will score a goal within extra time. So what this means is that, Portugal is going to get back into it. That's a conclusion. That's what you think will happen because Ronaldo is in good form and is very much capable of getting goals. Another person says, well, Portugal will play an attacking game. Again, that doesn't really state a conclusion, but you could say that Portugal will win or Portugal will take it back in because they'll play an attacking game. In fact, what's also interesting about that one is that if you say Portugal will play an attacking game, that's an assumption that could really lead to either conclusion. You could say Spain will go up 3-1 because Portugal will play an attacking game and therefore leave space open. So what we really want here is, I want the conclusion and why you think the conclusion will happen. So now let's see, some more of you have started to put that forward. Portugal will win because Ronaldo is in great scoring form. That's good. So the conclusion and why the conclusion, because Ronaldo is in form. That's not a piece of information that was given in the argument, but it's something that you think could happen. Portugal will win. They've saved their best defender for such a situation and will stop Spain from scoring. So it is not just that. It's not just that Ronaldo will score, but also that Portugal will maintain a good defense. Portugal, the game will go into penalties because Portugal will go on all-out attack. The game will go into penalties because Ronaldo will score. Portugal will win because clearly Ronaldo's been brought in. Portugal wins because Ronaldo is, 12 minutes may not be. Some of you, I think, read the question wrong. I'm saying that Portugal is 2-1 down to Spain. Ronaldo is being brought on to attack. I think some of you have read it the other way around, that he's, on to defend, and that has its own impact. But okay, no. Spain's leading, right? And, well, Ronaldo's been brought on to attack. Now, okay, in a lot of cases, those were quite interesting, right, answers. I think that you all got the general hang of it, that you might say that Spain might win, or that it might go to penalties, or that Portugal might win. And those would all be conclusions, because that's what you're trying to convince me will happen. That'll be the outcome. Now, you might also try to convince me that Ronaldo is the best player in the world, but that's not what you're trying to convince me of regarding the outcome. What you're trying to convince me of in the outcome would be that Ronaldo being the best could result in so and so happening, right? So the information that you give to justify that outcome is stuff that you believe to be true, and that's why it leads to the thing that you're trying to convince me of. So essentially, when we get into an argument, we can say that there are things that we either know or believe to be true for sure. And that leads us, based on that, we can say what we think will happen as a result of those things being true or those things being facts. That's really what's going on. So it's what we think will happen and why we think it will happen. What we think will happen is what we're trying to convince people of. Why we think it will happen is what we believe to be true, which will help us lead to the thing happening. Let me give you a slightly different point of view, because a lot of you, focused on, okay, the substitution will change the outcome. I'm going to say that Spain is 2-1 up, and even though Ronaldo comes on, Spain will continue to win and they will continue to remain 2-1 up. And the reason that I say this is that it is now based on two things. One, it says here that Ronaldo was brought on as a substitute. Okay. Now, Ronaldo is clearly a very good player. So why is he being brought on as a substitute? Now, I'm going to add my own information, just like you all added the information of Ronaldo's in good form, Ronaldo's a good player, stuff like that, right? But, right, I'm going to say this. Ronaldo is a great player, but he's being brought on as a substitute. So this could be that Ronaldo is actually recovering from injury. That's why he didn't start the game. They've just brought him on for a few minutes. And that means that if he is coming back from injury, he may not be as effective. And therefore, Spain will hold on and Spain will win. All right. So the point there would be, right, that Ronaldo comes on for Portugal, tries to score, but I'm saying that ultimately Spain is going to win because Ronaldo has been brought on as a substitute. This suggests that he's injured. Now, what am I trying to convince you of here? I'm not trying to convince you that Ronaldo is injured. What I'm trying to convince you of is an outcome, that Spain is going to continue to hang on and they're going to win. However, what I am giving you as facts that lead to that would be, one, Ronaldo is brought on as a substitute. Two, substitutes generally are players who are not fully fit or secondary players, right? And, if we know that Ronaldo is good, that suggests that he's not fully fit. So he'll not have as much of an outcome on the game, which will result in Spain hanging on. Now let's try to put all of that together within a framework that applies no matter what. Now this applies to all CR questions. Premises, assumptions, and together they make up a conclusion. All right, so what do we mean by premises, assumptions, and conclusion? What are premises, assumptions, and conclusions? What do they do, and how do we categorize the things that we just spoke about as premises, assumptions, and conclusions? Okay, now the place that you want to start with any argument should always be the conclusion of the argument. Whenever you're in doubt, and even if you're not in doubt, the best place to start is always the conclusion, because without a conclusion, you don't have an argument, because then it's just you saying some things that you think are true. That's it. That's not what we're looking at. A conclusion is something that you think will happen based on statements that you think are true. You're not just trying to convince someone that something is true or not. You're trying to say that based on these things that we accept to be true, I believe that something will happen. And if you don't believe that anything will happen, or you're not trying to make a ruling on something, then you're just stating stuff. That's not an argument. So that means that every argument must have a conclusion. That's the most basic building block. And in order to get to this conclusion, it uses facts that are stated, called premises, and facts that the person making up the conclusion believes but are not stated, called assumptions. So if I say that Portugal is going to win, or a lot of you said that Portugal is going to win, I say that Portugal is going, or that you all say that Portugal is going to win. That's what you believe will be the outcome, and you base that on facts that are stated as well as facts that are not stated. Facts that are stated, they're only 2-1 down, and there's 12 minutes to go. There's still time for them to get back in the game, right? You could say facts that are not stated. Ronaldo has been in fantastic form and therefore should be able to score. Let's say your conclusion is that it's going to go to penalties. Facts that are stated. Okay, there are 12 minutes to go, which is some time for sure, but it is not enough time to, go ahead and get 2 goals to take them all the way back into a winning position, right? They can only maybe score 1 goal in that time. Facts that are not stated. Ronaldo is, Ronaldo getting in doesn't really change the dynamics that much. It just makes Portugal slightly better, so they are able to maybe get to 1 goal. Let's say you say that Spain will hang on. Facts that are stated. Spain is currently leading the match. Facts that are not stated. Ronaldo could be coming on as a substitute because he is injured. So we have what we think will happen, but we also have, in order to get to that, facts. Facts that are stated and facts that are not stated. Now, the things that are not stated, well, they could turn out to not be true also, because they're not stated. They're just something that, you've pulled out to say, hey, okay, I think that's the case. But, right, for now, we consider them as facts. For now, we say, okay, that's a thing that you're relying on in order to get to the conclusion. So, putting this back in, the facts that are stated are premises. So anything that an argument tells you within the argument, anything that you see here, facts here that are stated are premises. Portugal is 2-1 down to Spain. That's a fact, that's a premise. There are 12 minutes left in extra time. That's a fact, that's a premise. Ronaldo has just now come on as a sub. He's brought on for a defender. So instead of a defender, they've put on an attacker, Ronaldo, right? So these are all facts that are stated. The conclusion is what you think will happen as a result. So if added to this, it said, hence, Portugal is going to win. That would be a conclusion. Or based on this, it looks likely that the game will go till penalties. That is a conclusion. Based on this, it looks like Spain will hang on, right? That will be a conclusion. So really, we have the facts that are stated and a conclusion, but these facts alone are not enough to get to the conclusion. So what do we have now? We know that Portugal is 2-1 down. We know that there's 12 minutes left, and we know that Ronaldo has just come on. If we're being really honest with ourselves, all of these are nice to say that Portugal will come back into it, or that it'll do this or they'll do that, but any of them could happen. So we don't actually know. So when we state our conclusion, when we say that, hey, okay, based on this, the outcome is going to be this or it's going to be that, that outcome must be also based on some facts that are not stated. If I say that Spain is going to win, right, I can say use all of the facts that are given here, but I must also then say something else which can make it more likely, or that sort of leads me in that direction that Spain actually is going to hang on, right? I could say that Ronaldo is injured. I could say that Spain's defense is very intelligent. I could say a bunch of these other things, that Spain's defense has a lot of stamina so they can keep up and they're not actually tired. Whatever else I want to say, I need to say one of those things, because that is what will help me get to saying that, oh, that Spain is probably going to win this match. Because I could also take all of these facts that are stated and say Portugal is going to win, right? Just by saying that, oh, because Ronaldo is in very good form and blah, blah, blah. So therefore, right, we need the facts that are stated and we need the facts that are not stated. They are both essential to make up any argument. The facts that are stated are called premises. The facts that are not stated are called assumptions. So now when we say that there are premises, assumptions, and together they make up a conclusion, what's very important to remember is, well, two things. One, you're only really dealing with two types of components. What the argument is telling you to be true, and what the argument is trying to tell you is a fact, and what the argument is trying to tell you will happen. What the argument is trying to tell you is a fact would be a premise or an assumption. What the argument is trying to tell you will happen will be a conclusion. The other thing is that, right, when you look at an argument, what would you see? You will see a conclusion most of the time. There are some types of questions called inference questions, for which you yourself have to give a conclusion. So therefore, you will not see a conclusion there. For some types of questions, like bold-faced questions, you could see multiple conclusions. So, stuff like that can be a little bit, these are, sort of mild exceptions to the rule. But for the most part, you will see one conclusion that an argument is trying to convince you of. The thing that the argument is trying to tell you will happen, but they're not trying to tell you that it is true or that it is something that is, but it is something that will be, or that will take place, right? So that's really what we're looking at there. Now, the next part, when we take a look at the facts that they're trying to give you, well, if we say that premises are facts that are stated and assumptions are facts that are not stated, you will never actually see an assumption in a question. You will never see an assumption, right? In this section, none of these things are assumptions, and they're not assumptions by definition. They're not assumptions. It's not that they're not assumptions because, oh, it doesn't seem likely that this, it doesn't seem like that's true or untrue. When we talk about assumptions on a day-to-day basis, we often talk about assumptions being, something that is backed up and something that is not backed up. And we say, don't assume. But that's not really what the definition of an assumption is. An assumption is simply something that you believe to be true without having to state that you believe it to be true. So if we get into what an assumption is here, right? An assumption is simply something that, is not stated. And if it is not stated, that means it's not going to be in the argument, right? So in a CR argument, you will only ever see premises and a conclusion. You will never actually see any assumptions because assumptions are not stated. Also, premises and assumptions do pretty much the same thing, right? But the way that they impact the question is slightly different. All right, now that we understand that that's what an argument is really composed of, right? There's certain things that we have to keep in mind that sort of matter while breaking down what an argument is, and then we can actually get into solving a few questions. Okay, information from outside. Now, in the answer options, right, you might see information that doesn't look like it's related to the information that is given to you in the stimulus, information that's been given to you by the person that is arguing whatever it is that they're arguing. And sometimes when you see that, you're like, oh, wow, okay, well, that information wasn't mentioned anywhere. That must be super irrelevant. Let's just go ahead and get rid of it. It doesn't matter. However, right, outside information can still impact the conclusion. We just saw in the Spain versus Portugal situation, right? Knowing whether Ronaldo was injured or not could impact the conclusion. All relevant assumptions impact the validity of the argument in some way or the other, and it is your job to identify this relationship. So when you see an assumption, right, when you look at the answer options and you see assumptions within them, things that they're telling you are true and how they may affect the argument, rather than saying, look at the information in this assumption and think about whether that information is related or not, what you have to do instead is take the statement that you're reading in the answer option to be a true statement. Read it and say, okay, now I'm accepting this as true. What does this do to my conclusion? Does it make my conclusion more likely? Does it make my conclusion less likely? Does it take my conclusion in some other direction? That's what you really have to ask yourself. Now that we have all of this information, let's go back to that first GMAT question that we tried to see, and let's take a look at why answer option D actually works. A researcher discovered blah, blah, blah. Okay, you know what? I'm not going to read it again. Let's actually just go through this and quickly try to figure out what the conclusion of the argument is first, because that's really what we need, right? That's if we're not sure what to do, even if we're sure what to do, the thing that you want to do is to start with the conclusion, because everything will come out of the conclusion. That's the thing that they're trying to convince you of. That's the basis of a GMAT argument. Well, that's pretty obvious in this case. The researcher concluded from this experiment that the immune system protects against mental illness as well as against physical disease. Cool. So what they're trying to convince us of is that immune system protects against both of these things. That's it. Not about a high immune system or a low immune system or a strong. Really what they're trying to convince us is that the immune system can protect you against both of these things. Really, that's all there is to it. Why are they saying that? Well, there are premises, there must be assumptions as well, but let's read the premises because they're actually in the argument. People who have low levels of immune system activity score lower on tests of mental health. So what they found is that low immunity and low mental health, right? Those two go hand in hand. Low immunity and low mental health happen together. Based on that, they said that immunity affects mental health. Immunity protects against mental health, because when the immunity is not there, there is no mental health. Now, what we have to find out is another assumption, something that they believe, right, which must also be true for the argument to work. If this happens to not be true, then the argument will not work, because this is something that must take us in that direction. If it's a true statement, it will take us in that direction. If it is not a true statement, it will probably not take us in that direction. So let's actually go over these answers again now. High immune system activity protects against mental illness better than normal immune system activity does. Now that's something that, if you believe the conclusion to already be true, you might say that that seems a bit more likely, that the high protects better than the normal or whatever, right? It might be a further conclusion, but this is not something that, if we know that this is true, we can't necessarily say that the immune system protects against both better, right? That the immune system protects against both, in a very significant way, because it's just telling us that the high level of immunity is better than the normal level of immunity, but we don't even know if both of those are relevant or both of those actually have a kind of impact in any way at all. So we can't actually say then that that leads us to saying that for sure, well, the immune system does in fact protect against mental health. If we say mental illness is similar to physical disease in its effects, again, that's just telling us that mental health and physical disease, like poor mental health and physical disease, they look kind of similar. But that doesn't tell us that the immune system protects against both. That's just telling us what they look like. That doesn't lead us towards the immune system helps protect against both. C says, people with high immune system activity cannot develop mental illness. Again, if that is true, maybe it makes it a little bit more likely. But if that turns out to be false, well, that doesn't really make it less likely. So that means that it doesn't impact the conclusion. It doesn't actually help lead to the conclusion. It isn't actually a fact that the conclusion is trying to rely on, because, well, if it's false and the conclusion can still be true, then the conclusion isn't relying on it. It's nice to have, but it's not something being relied on. So we can go ahead and get rid of C as well. But D, on the other hand, says mental illness does not cause people's immune system activity to decrease. Now, if we're saying that mental illness doesn't cause the immune system activity to decrease, yeah, that could lead us to saying that, the immune system does affect mental illness. However, right, if this turns out to be not true at all, that mental illness does cause people's immune system activity to decrease, all of a sudden, the conclusion doesn't add up anymore. Because if we're saying that the immune system protects against mental illness, and this is saying that the mental illness affects the immune system, well, that would be a circular argument. That would not add up anymore. So if anything, what we're trying to say is that, very simply, that these two are related: low immune system, low mental health. Now, how do we know that A affects B? We know that we can conclude that A affects B if we know that B does not affect A. So what we've essentially done is we've just turned the argument on its head by saying that, well, what was necessary to be true for that conclusion to hold up? Well, if we're saying that A and B happen together, and the conclusion is that A causes B to happen, well, if A and B happen together, a bunch of different things could be the case. It could be that A causes B. It could also be that B causes A. By saying that B does not cause A, we are actually then making it more likely that A does cause B. If B did in fact cause A, our argument would make no sense at all. So what we're really looking at there is the fact that these are the points that we have here. We are supposed to accept them to be true facts and then see whether they are necessary for our conclusion to actually make sense or not. So whenever you get a CR argument, what you really have to try and break things down to is to say that in any given CR argument, there is a conclusion, there is the thing that the argument is trying to convince us of, and then there are facts that are given to us in the stimulus itself, and there are facts that are not given to us, which could be given to us in the answer options. What we then have to do is look through the answer options to see how the facts given in the answer options affect the conclusion. Do they help the conclusion become more likely? Are they necessary for the conclusion to be true? Do they help the conclusion become less likely? Can they affect the conclusion in multiple ways? That's really what we're then going to look at when we take a look at the answer options. So really, in order to understand a CR argument, the fundamental thing that you need to have behind a CR question is that there are premises and conclusions given to you in an argument. Premises and a conclusion. The conclusion is what you're trying to be convinced of. The premises are the facts that lead to that. In the options, you're going to get assumptions, and those assumptions can also affect the conclusion. So what you have to do is, rather than asking yourself whether the assumption itself is a true thing or not, or whether the assumption itself is likely or not, you're supposed to take the assumption to be true and then see, okay, now that I'm saying this is true, does it actually affect my conclusion? Does it make my conclusion more likely? Does it make it less likely? Does it actually have some sort of effect on what I think is going to happen? With that in mind, let us now actually try out a question. Let's see if there's any other questions. So yeah, let's actually try out a question. Okay, so the question's up for you here. I will give you 2 minutes to start putting in your answers. Let's see if we can still put it back on poll 4. If we can just relaunch poll 4 with, we'll clear the existing polling results. Excellent, let's do that. Great, so I've relaunched poll 4 and that gives you all an opportunity to try and answer this question. I'll leave it open for 1 minute and 30 seconds from now because you've already had some time to see it, and then we'll discuss the answer. All right, only 3 votes so far. That means that that's something we clearly need to work on, a little bit of time management. Sometimes, you know, you want to just go ahead and try and give yourself an answer, even if you're not 100% sure. I see a bunch of answers just came in. I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. Most of you think it is answer option E, and that's absolutely right. So great job there. Now I am going to, let's go over why it is E. Let me just move the poll to the side. Cool. So why is this E? Now, firstly, we got to understand what the conclusion is. And the conclusion here is actually this last sentence here. So only if the temperature in the Brazilian ashes environment never exceeds 95 degrees Fahrenheit will its rings be a reliable measure of the tree's age. Okay, now here's the thing. They talked a lot about the tree losing rings when it is hot, right? So that means that you could say that, well, okay, it's likely that what I'm looking for is something to do with, you know, the tree losing rings and the heat and whatnot. But the conclusion is actually telling us something very, very specific, and we need to pick the option that leads to that conclusion, which is the rings be a reliable measure of the tree's age. Can we tell the age of the tree by looking at the number of rings, right? And they're saying that you can do this only if the temperature doesn't go above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So only if the temperature stays below 95 degrees Fahrenheit will you be able to tell the age based on the rings. So what would make to make the conclusion more likely, that would be that yes, okay, you know, you can only tell the age if the temperature doesn't go above. But to make the conclusion less likely will not be about saying, oh, you can't do this or anything. In fact, it would be that even if the temperature goes above 95, you can still tell the age from the rings. So let's take a look at the options. The growth of new rings in a tree is not a function of levels of precipitation. We're not looking at the growth of new rings. We're looking at whether you can talk about rings and age. So A is out. B says only the Brazilian ash loses rings because of excessive heat. So that's trying to basically tell us that no other plants do that. Now that's true. That still doesn't tell us anything about the link between rings and age. It doesn't make it more likely. It's not something that the conclusion relies upon, that we have to have the temperature be below to be able to tell age from rings. It just tells us that this kind of activity is only necessary with the Brazilian ash. C says only 1 day of temperatures above 95 degrees Fahrenheit is needed to cause the Brazilian ash to lose a ring. Now, this is something that you may have been considering, even if you picked answer option E in the end, you might have been considering this. And this is, in fact, the trap answer in this question. Because if you see this, it says that, well, if it goes above 95, the Brazilian ash loses a ring. Therefore, if it loses a ring, we can't tell the age anymore. But if we know that it just loses a ring, and that it just loses that one ring, all we have to do is look at the number of years in which the temperature went above 95, and we can then we can add that to the number of rings that there are, and we'll still be able to tell the age of the tree. So this is not about whether the tree loses rings or not. This is about based on the rings that are there, can you tell the tree's age? And for that reason, we can go ahead and get rid of answer option C. The internal rings of all trees, no, but we're only really looking at the Brazilian ash, so this is not relevant. And therefore, it has got to be answer option E. The number of rings that will be lost is not predictable. So the conclusion they made is that we cannot tell the age from the rings. That's really what they've told us. We can't tell the age from the number of the rings, right? Well, what is necessary to be true? We can still tell the age from the number of the rings if we knew exactly how many rings were lost, predictable. So this is a fact, and it is necessary for this fact to be true in order for us to reach the conclusion. The conclusion relies on this fact being true in order for it to work as an effective conclusion. And that's why answer option D works here. So this is exactly the kind of question that becomes a whole lot easier once you recognize what the argument is actually trying to convince you of, and therefore that would be the conclusion, but also therefore everything else are just the facts that they're giving you. That's not that those are just the premises. They're still relevant, but they're not what the argument is trying to convince you of. They're not the things that you're trying to change. What you're actually trying to change, or what you're actually trying to think about that could be different, will always be the assumptions themselves. Let's take a shot at another question. Now, this is an interesting one because it is challenging for the same reason, but it is a little bit more challenging. Try to make sure to identify the question correctly here. I will open up the poll again, but sorry, not the question. Try to make sure to identify the conclusion properly here. It is, it will be of paramount importance for you to identify the conclusion in this question exactly right. You can go ahead and try it out. All right, we have about 60% of you who have answered. So let me just go ahead and close the poll. Nice, a few last minute responses. Okay, so let's share these results. Now I see that some of you went with B, some of you went with C, but more than half of you went with D. And you know what? D is the trap answer here. In fact, the right answer is answer option C for Charlie. So let's take a look at what's going on and how being able to understand the fundamentals, or approaching this question by looking at the fundamentals, would make this a much easier question to solve. So as always, we want to start by figuring out what the conclusion is. What are they trying to convince us of in this case? The DHS has proposed new federal requirements for driver's license that would allow them to be used as part of a national identification system. Well, that's just telling us what the DHS is trying to do. So that's a premise. Using licenses for purposes not directly related to operating a motor vehicle is un-American because it would require US citizens to carry the equivalent of papers. Okay. This seems like something they could be trying to convince us of, but it's not absolutely certain. So let's just keep this, let's put a pin in it for now and move on to the next point. Such a requirement would allow the government to restrict their movements and activities in the manner of totalitarian regimes. Now, that sounds a hell of a lot like a conclusion. That sounds like something that they're trying to say is what's going to happen. But what they're really saying is such a requirement would allow the government to restrict movement. Now, that is simply a fact. That's not telling us that the government is going to restrict movement. It is just telling us that this would allow the government to restrict movement. And that's true. That's not something that we can actually debate. Yes, it would allow the government to do that. Would they do it? We don't know, but it would certainly allow that. So that's a fact, and that too would be a premise. So this requirement, right, of the national identification system thing would allow the government to do so and so, okay? In time, this could make other limits of freedom acceptable. Again, they're just saying that this is what can happen as a result. They're not trying to tell us that this is what is going to happen. They're not trying to say that this is what the outcome will be. They're just trying to say that if the government is allowed, that putting this identification allows the government, yes, it makes it possible for the government, that's just true. And if it is possible for the government to restrict freedom in one way, it becomes possible for the government to restrict freedoms in other ways. They're not telling us that the government will restrict freedoms in other ways. They're telling us that the government can do it if they have done one. And that's a fact. They're just telling us that that's true. So let's actually come back now to that other statement, the one that we weren't sure about, because that actually now must be the conclusion. Using licenses for purposes not directly related to operating a motor vehicle is un-American. Now they're saying that this is un-American because it would require all US citizens to carry papers. Okay, so really what they're trying to tell us is that that this thing is un-American. They're trying to convince us that this activity is un-American because it requires us to carry papers. So really, the conclusion here is about what can be constituted as being American or not. And the conclusion that they've come to is that doing this activity is un-American because it requires us to carry papers. So now let's take a look at the answer options and see which ones are bogus and which one actually is necessary for the conclusion to rely upon. The first one says the next presidential election will be dishonest. Remember, you're not asking yourself, will it be dishonest? That's not what we're trying to find out. We're supposed to accept the statement as true and see if it impacts the argument. But so what if the next presidential election will be dishonest? That doesn't tell us anything about whether using a license is un-American or not. The government will start curtailing the activities of those it considers dissidents. So the government will do this. That still doesn't tell us whether it is un-American. Is it American to curtail people's freedoms and whatnot of those it contains dissidents? Actually, it is very American to curtail the freedoms of those it considers dissidents. If you're familiar with American history, it's totally an American thing to do. They have locked up socialists for hundreds of years. But that is what it is. So the point there is that if we say that the government is going to do this, it still doesn't tell us whether carrying a license is un-American, unless you automatically believe that, oh, like that must be, that curtailing the activities is an un-American activity. But we don't know that. We don't know that in any way. So C says, blanket restrictions on law-abiding individuals are contrary to the traditions of American culture and law. Now, this answer works because it is actually making a claim that genuinely impacts the conclusion. It is making a claim about what we can consider to be American or not. They're saying blanket restrictions, which is basically asking everyone to carry papers, even those who are obeying the laws, right? You still have to carry ID. Blanket restrictions are against the traditions of American culture and law. So they're trying to say that asking people to carry papers, right, makes something un-American. It is contrary to what we would consider American culture and law. And this is actually necessary to tell us that such an activity is un-American, because until then, they're just telling us what the activity is and what, like this being true, what does it, what must be true as a result of it. They're not trying to convince us of anything else other than the fact that this is an un-American activity, right? And therefore, right, if we need to come back to it now and say, okay, what the conclusion is about what is American or not, this is an answer that actually addresses what is American or not. On the other hand, let's take a look at D. Because you may have seen this, you may have thought, okay, it's tempting, it looks like it could be right, but then why do you go ahead and pick D? Because you weren't able to eliminate D, right? So let's try and see how we can eliminate D. The majority of Americans are not willing to give up their right to travel and move. Now that seems very likely, right? Because we're saying that doing this is, what we have done is we've said that doing all of this is a bad idea. That's how when we read something, our brain tends to put it in terms of good and bad, that this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do, right? That the government shouldn't set up this national ID system. And all of that makes sense. But at the same time, what we're actually trying to say is that this activity is un-American, not that it's good or bad. And they're saying that whether this activity is un-American or not has nothing to do with whether American citizens are going to, accept this to happen or not. What we need then is to find out what do we consider American. That would be American law and culture, right? The things that we have that are traditionally seen to be a part of what America does, right? And we have to compare it with that. So whether Americans are willing to do this or not actually is about telling us that this is something that might lead to us saying, oh, this is curtailing freedoms. Now, generally, we associate America with freedom. So we might say, oh, these two things are not in line with each other or whatnot. But that's exactly the point, that this conclusion had nothing to say about actually curtailing freedoms. This conclusion had something to say about simply whether this was an American activity or not. And we are now addressing what makes something an American activity, which is what helps us come to the right answer. All right. Let's move on now to another question. By the way, does anyone have any questions at this point? If you do have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat. But okay, let's move on to a final question before we wrap things up. All right, let's take a look at this one. This is one that's interesting. It's a little bit challenging, but let's try it out nonetheless. I'm going to put it up and then you all can give your answers. Okay, 9 votes. All right, now I see some B's, some C's, some E's. That's good. And you know what? This should hopefully tell you something about like strategizing on the GMAT, because you may have noticed this come up from time to time as well, that 2 of the answers are generally pretty ridiculous. Sometimes in a harder question could be 1 of the answers, but usually 2 of the answers are pretty ridiculous. And that's good news for you, because it means that you can always work half of the way towards answering the question. To eliminate the last 2, yeah, okay, that could be a bit harder. But across the board, right, you all thought it had to be either B, C, or E, right? And you knew that it wasn't A or D. So let's go ahead and see what's going on here. In fact, once again, right, I think that a lot of you got trapped, but E is the trap answer option. The right answer option in this case is actually answer option B for Bravo. Let's figure out what's going on in this case. So, more of you picked E than anything else, but let's see why, answer option E doesn't work and why B and C do. So the conclusion, what is the conclusion? The record industry is fighting a losing battle. It simply does not have the resources to prosecute all of the individuals who illegally download music from the internet. Okay, so it doesn't have the resources, and therefore it is a limited number of individuals who will be charged with a crime because they don't have enough resources to prosecute. So it's not about, when they say resources, there's different types of resources, right? Resources to find out what's going on, resources to prosecute and whatnot, right? So they don't have enough resources to prosecute. Therefore, the number of individuals will be charged will be limited, right? And if the number of individuals charged will be limited, the actions of the recording industry will have a very minimal impact on reducing the amount of illegally downloaded music. Okay, now the conclusion here is that the actions of the recording industry will have a minimal impact because they will charge a limited number of people. That's the point that they're trying to put forward. That's the thing that they're trying to convince us will happen. The actions will have a minimal impact. But the question is slightly different, and that's what makes this question a bit more challenging. It says the answer to which of the following questions would best help evaluate the accuracy of the conclusion above. Evaluate the accuracy. Now, when you're evaluating somebody or evaluating something, if somebody evaluates you on your job performance, in the most simple terms, what they're doing is they're telling you whether your performance was good or bad. I mean, we know it's more complicated than that, but at its most basic terms, when you're evaluating something, you're just basically stating the good or bad about that thing. So if we're talking about evaluating the accuracy of the conclusion, what we're trying to do then is we're trying to basically say that we're able, the answer to which of the following questions would help tell us whether the conclusion is sound or unsound. Evaluate the accuracy, say whether the conclusion is accurate or accurate. Means that, right, the answer to the question, if you answer it one way, it should tell you that the conclusion is accurate. But if you answer it the other way, it should tell you that the conclusion is inaccurate. And for this reason, it helps to sort of think of these questions in yes, no terms. So let's just take a look at answer option A, because that's one that you obviously all knew was incorrect. Will recording industry lawyers dedicate the majority of their time to prosecuting those who illegally download music? Now, the answers to that could be yes, they will dedicate the majority of their time, and no, they will not dedicate the majority of their time. But if we're saying that it will help evaluate the accuracy, if the answer is yes, it should maybe help the conclusion along because it's telling you that the conclusion is accurate. If the answer is no, it should maybe hurt the conclusion because it's telling you that the conclusion is inaccurate. Now, it could be flipped. Answering yes means that the conclusion is wrong. Answering no means that the conclusion is right. It could be that. But the point is that when you answer these questions, and you should try to answer them in the form of a binary, yes, no, high, low, many, few, anything like that. But the different answers should lead you to different conclusions. So the conclusion that they have here is actions of the recording industry will have a minimal impact. Answering the question one way should say, yes, it will have a minimal impact. Answering the question the other way should say, no, it will not have a minimal impact. It will actually have a significant impact. So let's take a look at answer option C, because I think some of you picked C, and let's eliminate that first. Do many individuals who illegally download songs share their music files with other internet users? Now, if the answer to this question is yes, well, it means that the actions of the recording industry will certainly have a minimal impact, because anyway they will. Even if the answer is no, even if these people don't share, well, we still know that because they're not able to charge enough people, the actions will have a limited impact. So if these people share or they don't share, the conclusion kind of remains the same. So with both answers, we're leading to saying that the conclusion is probably accurate. But we want to be able to say that the answer can tell us whether the conclusion is accurate or not accurate. This just confirms what we already have, so it doesn't really affect what we have as our basis. Let's take a look at E now. Will the threat of prosecution alter the behavior? If the answer to this is no, it will not alter the behavior, then the actions of the recording industry will have a minimal impact. The conclusion is upheld. If the answer is yes, if the actions of the recording industry will alter the behavior. Now, ideally, we should say, oh, if it will alter the behavior, then the actions will actually not have a minimal impact. There will actually be a significant impact. But it says impact on reducing the amount. Now, let's actually think about a real world situation here. Some years ago, they tried to shut down the Pirate Bay, right? They said, oh, this is a problem. Music piracy is bad, not just music. All piracy is bad, right? Whether it's like video games or movies or TV shows or whatever, right? And they tried to ban the site Pirate Bay. So they put legal action, right, to alter the behavior of those who illegally download. And what happened then? The number of people or the amount of illegal downloading that happened went up. It didn't go down, it went up because people just worked even harder. They felt like, piracy is an important right and that it is wrong on the part of, these big businesses to charge for their intellectual property in this way. And they actually went, even more intensely with trying to illegally download. So when we say that the threat of prosecution will alter their behavior, well, usually we tend to think that the threat of prosecution will make people stop doing things. But sometimes the threat of prosecution for something that is unfair might actually cause people to do it more to make that statement that it is unfair, right? And that's literally how all protesting works anyway. So if the answer to this question is no, the conclusion is upheld. But if the answer is yes, we don't actually know whether the conclusion is hurt or upheld. Both things are possible. And for that reason, we can go and eliminate E. Now let's come to answer option B. Is a small minority of individuals responsible for the majority of illegal song downloads? Now, if the answer to this question is no, it means that everyone is kind of downloading things equally because a small minority is not responsible for all the song downloads. Everyone's downloading. Then the actions of the recording industry will have a minimal impact. It will not have a big impact. But let's say it's a small minority of individuals are responsible for most of the illegal song downloads. There's like 100 people and they download like 80% of all illegal music. Now, even though you can only prosecute a few people, if you prosecute the right people, your actions are actually going to have a major impact on reducing the amount of illegally downloaded music. Your actions will actually have a significant impact in doing that. So by answering this question one way, the accuracy of the conclusion was verified. By answering it the other way, the accuracy of the conclusion was hurt. So therefore, this is an option that actually allows us to evaluate the accuracy of the conclusion. All right. Now I see one question that has come in. I'm going to take that question while I'm answering it. If any other questions come in, I will take those as well, and then we will wrap up. The question is how to do negation. Okay, so that's interesting. How do we do negation? What is negation anyway? When we say negation, negation is essentially taking something to be untrue. So that basically means that we're trying to see what would happen if something is untrue. Now, these are all yes or no questions, so we can't say true or not true. But let's go back to a question that was find the assumption, right? Let's go back to, in fact, the Department of Homeland Security one, because that's one that a lot of you had a bit of trouble with. So when we negate, what we're essentially doing is taking something to be not true. I've said that what you should do is you have to treat the options that are here as facts. You have to treat them as facts. Even when you answer them as yes or no in the last question, once you're answering it as yes, you're taking it as a fact that that thing is yes. Or if you answer it no, you're taking it as a fact that it is no. So here as well, let's take answer option D as a fact. The majority of Americans are not willing to give up their right to travel and move without identification. This is a fact that we're taking to be true. Now, if this is true, it should probably help the conclusion along. But if we're saying that the conclusion relies on it, then we're saying that it's necessary for it to be true. How do you figure out whether it is necessary for something to be true? Well, let's think about it like this. How do you find out if it is necessary for you to do the GMAT? Try to apply without doing the GMAT and see if you get in. So how do you see whether it is necessary for something to be true? Let's see what happens if it's false. That's what negation is. So if we say the majority of Americans are not willing to give up their right to travel and move without identification. Let's take this statement now, instead of it to be true, let's take it to be false and see if the conclusion can still stand. If the conclusion can still stand even though this is false, it means that it doesn't rely on it to be true. It just means that it being true could maybe help it, but it's not relying on it. So let's go ahead and see now with option D what happens. The majority of the Americans are willing to give up the right to travel and move. Well, if the majority of Americans are willing to do it, it could still be un-American. It could still, it's still possible that you could say that this is un-American. Even if the majority of people are willing to do it, you could still say that it is un-American. Even if the majority of people in India are against gay people getting married, you could still say that gay people getting married is still very much Indian, even if people are against it. So even if people are willing to give up the right, it could still be un-American. So what that means, therefore, is that, right, if we say that, if we take a look at statement D and we say that it is false, right, or if we take it to be false, it is still possible with it being false for the conclusion to add up and be true nonetheless. And that's what negation is. So we negated this statement and the conclusion still worked. That's a problem. If we're saying that it is necessary, then negating it should make it not work. So let's go to answer option C, which is the right answer here. Blanket restrictions are contrary to American culture and law. Let's now say blanket restrictions are not contrary to American culture and law. So now we're saying that blanket restrictions don't go against being American. Well, if blanket restrictions don't go against being American, then it's not correct to say that asking people to carry the licenses is un-American, because we're literally saying that it doesn't go against being American. So therefore, if you negate this statement, the entire conclusion doesn't add up anymore. The entire conclusion falls on itself. And therefore, right, negation is basically something you can do. It is not a necessary technique, but if you're unsure, you just want to confirm your answer, you can negate a statement and then see whether the conclusion still works. Even if the statement is untrue, does the conclusion do what does the conclusion go in the direction that you're expecting it to go? And if the conclusion happens to be true anyway, if the conclusion goes in the same direction anyway, it means that this assumption didn't actually affect the conclusion. Because if the conclusion is true, whether this is negated or true, or the conclusion is false, whether this is negated or false, this answer option didn't really have an impact then. So that's really what negation is a useful technique for. All right. I don't see that any other questions have come in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap things up. It did take about an hour and a half, but thank you all for taking this hour and a half to work through it. If it's okay, can we work on another problem? All right, let's try one last problem. Why not? Okay, how about this one right here? Right? The question says, which of the following, if true, supports the restaurant proprietor's economic stance? That means that the restaurant proprietor's economic stance is going to be the conclusion in this question. Go through it and give me an answer, considering that it is the economic stance of the proprietors that is going to make up the conclusion. I'm not going to open the poll for this one. You can just put it on the chat when you think you have an answer. All right, I see some E's, a lot of E's. Now this is, again, I would say I'm going to end the poll here, right? 9 votes have come in. And you know what? None of you got this right. The correct answer here is actually answer option D, D for Delta. So let's see what's going on here and why so many of you picked answer option E. And yes, this is a difficult question for sure, but it's all in the reading. So it says supports the restaurant proprietor's economic stance. So what we got to see is what the restaurant proprietor's economic stance is. And that can really be found over here. Proprietors of restaurants in prohibition land are protesting the ban on the grounds that it'll reduce their revenues and profits. Great. So what is their stance? Their stance is the ban will reduce our revenues and profits. And we're trying to support that. So we want some statement which, if we find it to be, like if we take it as a true statement, the effect should be, well, probably, right, that the ban will reduce revenues and profits. Well, what are the facts that we have now? What are the premises that we have now? All the premises actually suggest the opposite. So we are trying to go against what the premises kind of suggest, because the suggestion of the premises is that wherever there were restrictions enacted last year, and where the restrictions were enacted, the sales tax increased by 50%. Where the restrictions were not enacted, the sales tax only rose by 30%. So where there were restrictions, there were more sales because there was more sales tax. So where there were restrictions, there were more sales. Where there were no restrictions, there were still more sales. There were still more sales. It's just that the rate of increase was less. So that's something we have to keep in mind. What we want is to actually find an option which goes to the proprietor stance that it might reduce, not that it will increase at a slower rate, that it might reduce their revenues and profits. So let's take a look at the options one by one. In the provinces that restricted alcoholic beverages, there was a short-term negative impact. Okay, so there was a short-term negative impact. Now, this fact is true. Well, it does start to go in that reduction direction. But it says that there was a short-term negative impact. What that just tells us is that, well, okay, if there was a short-term negative impact, at least across the year, there was the impact was positive. Because we know that across the year, it increased by 50%. So even if there was a short-term impact, so what? Who cares? B says, the sales tax in prohibition land is lower on food and beverages than it is on other consumer goods, such as clothing. Well, none of you picked this, and that's quite clear because this is comparing food to clothing, and we only care about the restaurants. C says the consumption of alcoholic beverages in prohibition land has been on a gradual decline in the last 20 years. Now, if this is true, and the sales taxes paid went up, that means that banning the sales, or that would have no impact whatsoever. Because if the alcohol is on the, now you could say that if alcohol is on the decline, right, and banning it made it go up, well, if anything, that's kind of suggesting the opposite to us. What we want is to support the restaurant proprietor's economic stance, which is sales will go down, revenue will go down. So that's also out. Now let's take a look at E first, right, between D and E, because a lot of you picked E. It says overall sales tax revenue did not increase at a substantially higher rate in the provinces that enacted the restrictions than in the rest of prohibition land. So the places that enacted the restrictions, it was not much higher, but it was still higher, right? So what that's telling you is that the effect is what it's actually kind of suggesting is that since it's not that much higher, but it's only slightly higher, let's say it's only slightly higher to the point where we could basically say that it's the same. But then what that's basically saying is still that sales tax revenue is increased. And that's still going against what the the economic stances of the proprietors, which is that their revenue will go down. This is just saying that, oh, it didn't go higher by that much, but it still went higher. So that's why E is incorrect. And just by doing that, we should be able to pick D. But let's actually see why D works. The deal with D here is that the key difference is restrictions. They enacted restrictions last year and they continued to make more money. So if we're trying to say that they're going to make less money, what we have to actually find is that something else is going to result in them making less money. Well, what is going to result in them making less money? The plan is to ban alcoholic beverages. These were restrictions. So when there were restrictions, the sales went up. When there was a ban, we don't know about the ban. They're saying that the ban will make the sales go down. So maybe something about the restrictions were such that, they were still able to sell a lot of alcohol. They were still able to get revenue from alcohol, and they'll not be able to get that now. And that's why they're worried. That's why their stance is that the profits will go down. So D now says the restrictions on alcoholic beverages enacted last year. So the last year's restrictions allowed for the service of drinks. Remember, you might have seen this and said, well, okay, no, but I saw the word ban before. This can't be true. Why is this true, right? That doesn't add up. But remember, you're not questioning whether these things are true. You're saying this is true. So in the restrictions, they allowed service of drinks during dinner time. Now you should be like, hey, wait a second. Why does it say ban? The plan now is to ban. So before, they put restrictions, but you could still have drinks at dinner. Well, that allowed them to keep making a lot of revenue through selling drinks. With the ban, that revenue is going to go away. So now it becomes more likely that their profits and revenues will go down. And it's for that reason then that answer option D works out to being the right answer here. So there's two things that I want you to think about with this question. One is process of elimination. You got to go through process of elimination if you want to try to answer a question. The other thing is you got to be very careful at reading, right? When we say reading and interpreting the English language, well, this is really what it's about. You got to read carefully to make sure that you understand what the conclusion specifically is and what you're trying to actually support in this case. I saw somebody raise their hand, but the raise hand function doesn't work as it should. If you have a question, can you please just type it in on the chat window or on the Q&A window? All right, it doesn't seem as if the question has come in, so it could have been an accidental click. Well, in that case, you know what? Thank you all so much for your time. I'm going to call it over here. If there are parts of this webinar that you might like to view again, I think it will be uploaded on YouTube eventually. I'm not exactly privy to that information, but my understanding is that these mostly come up. Somebody also says, shouldn't the restriction be defined in the stem if we have to make an assumption? An assumption is, so the assumption can be about anything. What you have to ask yourself is, if the statement is true, can it still affect the conclusion? So the restriction doesn't need to be defined in the stem. What the stem is simply telling you like whose conclusion and what you're supposed to do with the conclusion, right? So here it's telling you that it's the restaurant proprietor's conclusion that we're looking at and that we're trying to make it more likely. In the assumptions themselves, well, you're not making the assumptions, right? The assumptions are being made for you and you're just cycling through them to see what works. So when you see an assumption, right? What you have to make sure of is that it's simply looking at whether that assumption makes the conclusion more likely, whether it makes the conclusion less likely. It being true, does it affect the conclusion at all, right? And that's really what we want to take a look at. So in this case, the conclusion works because answer option D works because the restriction, if we take that to be true, that, oh, well, when they enacted restrictions last year, which we have been told they enacted restrictions last year, it's telling us more about the nature of those restrictions, that they were still able to make revenue from alcohol. Now they'll not be able to make revenue from alcohol, so that's that. Therefore, right, they feel like the revenue will go down. That's what we're looking at on that front. But all right, for the rest of you, thank you all so much. Take care, and I will maybe see you all around in another webinar. For those of you who are classroom students, I may even see you in class from time to time. Thanks a lot. Take care, everyone.